And they ran at him with one accord. In other words, they're all in agreement. They cast him out of the city and they stoned him. Well, they cast him out of the city because that's a law in Deuteronomy that you're not allowed to execute a Jew within the city walls. You have to take him outside the city walls to execute him. And they stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Very similar to what Jesus said from the cross. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Stephen is basically saying the same thing. Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Again, very much like Jesus' last words where he said, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. They don't realize the implications this has. And he said, and when he had said this, he fell asleep. So the difference between them, they're full of hatred and wrath and death, and he is full of the Holy Spirit and calmness and forgiveness to the very people who are executing him. So let's look a little bit about stoning. It is the prescribed method of execution. There's other methods of execution described in Deuteronomy as well. One of them is to be burned alive. Stoning was the most common. One of the things that's unique about Israeli execution biblically was that they were to not mutilate the body. They were to leave the body because it was in the image of God as good a condition as possible. Okay, so other cultures, kill the person, mutilate their body, leave it hanging, let the birds eat it, do all kinds of things to the body afterwards. And that was against the rules for the Jews. They weren't allowed to do that, okay? And which is one of the reasons that stoning rather than beheading was a Jewish execution, right? And you might be wondering why they had to go to Rome to get Jesus executed, but yet they could kill Stephen. Rome had rules about the right for capital punishment rest with Rome, unless it was simply a matter of something that had to do with your religion. The Jews that executed Jesus needed Rome to do it because the people were behind Jesus. They were all in favor of Jesus, and they needed a scapegoat. So they made it political, and they made his death about, he's trying to become a king. Remember, they accused him of that before Pilate. He's trying to become a king. He's going to overthrow Rome, and that's the things they accused him of. Stephen, they didn't have to go through that process because this was simply a blasphemy charge, and they were allowed to deal with that on their own. So they can go stone him. However, the stoning takes a trial. We've seen that. He was in front of the Sanhedrin, and it took a trial in order for that verdict to happen. You can't just hear somebody that you think is blaspheming, grab a couple of priests and drag them out and stone them, okay? So there has been a trial, and they did do that. And then there has to be, according to Deuteronomy, 2 witnesses, all right, that actually witnessed the blasphemy. And we know from reading further back into chapter 7, we know that they hired false witnesses against Stephen to claim that he had blasphemed against Moses, the law, and all of this, the temple and everything else. Same way with Jesus. They hired false witnesses to lie that he had blasphemed, all right? So here we are with Stephen, and they're ready for this process of stoning. And so it seems like a horrific way to die to me, to have people throw rocks at you until you're dead, all right, which is basically what this is. But there's actually some rules about it. The first 2 people to throw stones are the 2 witnesses. So the idea is if you truly believe the person is guilty enough to be able to be the executioner, then you throw the first stone. And that goes back to what Jesus was saying to the woman who was dragged out in front of the temple saying she committed adultery. Which one of you is going to throw the first stone? Yeah, who saw it? Okay? Yeah, and they all walk away. Another thing about this is that because they believed in leaving the body as intact as possible, the rules had evolved over the years, and this was included in the Mishnah, which is Jewish history, not necessarily follows the Bible totally because they added a lot of other rules and regulations along the way. So stoning required that a man is taken outside the city and he has to be put on a cliff or a hill that's at least twice the size of a man, so 12 feet, right? He has to be knocked off of a rise that's at least a 12-foot drop. If there is none, they build a platform, okay? And the idea is if he dies from the fall, then the law has been fulfilled, and they don't have to continue with the stoning, and his body's going to be pretty good, all right? So the first person who's the first witness is to push the person by the hips, to push them down this 12-foot drop, and hopefully he will land on his back. If he doesn't, they have to turn him over so that he is on his back. The second witness throws the actual first stone, and it is a very large stone, and he is aiming for the chest. The idea is to stop the heart. And if they do that, then it's done and over. We know from Stephen, it says they continued to stone him. They continued to stone him, and that's what that's about. He didn't die very quickly because he's young and he's healthy. And so we know at one point it says he knelt. So he evidently gets himself up on his knees in order to get into a position of prayer to ask God to forgive these people. So it says they continued to stone him. What else was I going to tell you about this? I think that's about it. All right. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to go on from this part where it says they laid their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. That's going to be very important. Saul, if you know the Damascus Road story, which we'll get to later, Saul becomes Paul, a missionary. Now, it's interesting that Saul is the one, it says they laid their robes at his feet. That means that Paul was probably the one who orchestrated this. He's in charge, okay? Which makes a lot of sense because we talked about before, I think I have a chart on some stuff here. Somewhere I did. I don't know how I put it so far at the end. Okay. One of the things about Stephen and Paul is that they're both Hellenistic Jews. They're both Jewish, okay? But they are not Palestinian Jews. They're not from Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, that area. They are from somewhere else. Paul is from Cilicia, okay, which means that and we know that his dad was Jewish, so he is a Jew, but he's very wealthy, he's very educated, he's highly educated, he's a very, very smart guy, and we saw last time that Stephen's ministry was that he went to the synagogues of the Hellenistic Jews and preached Christ to them. So more than likely, Paul and Stephen had been debating this whole issue for a while, and Paul wants to get rid of him. Paul is zealous. He calls himself Pharisee of the Pharisees. He's been educated by the highest Pharisee of the land, Gamaliel. That's kind of like going to the Harvard School of Theology. And big plans are for him. You know, he's going to probably be the next big teaching rabbi. And so we see that he's the one who is going to take the cloaks from them. Why do you think they give their coats to somebody? What do you think? Why would they do that? What do you think? That's it, yeah. They don't want to be hampered by their robes so that they can throw better. Yep, that's definitely part of it. The other idea is that they're in the Sanhedrin, they're there in court, in session. Are they wearing their everyday robe? Probably. No. They're like here, it's an official thing. They're probably in their Sunday best robe, so to speak, okay? And why would they take it off? They don't want to defile it with what? Yeah, they don't want to get blood splattered all over it, okay? So somebody's going to hold the coats, and Saul is the one there to do it, all right? So that leads us to chapter 8, where we're starting tonight. And the beginning of chapter 8 says, verse 1 says, now Saul was consenting to his death. That leaves no doubt, does it? Saul was consenting to his death. By the way, Saul is named Saul after King Saul from the Old Testament, okay? Why? Because King Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and so is this Saul, all right? He's not from the tribe of Judah or anything. They're both from the tribe of Benjamin. So that gives you another idea how, how religiously his family was involved in following every little thing about the Old Testament, okay? He's named after King Saul. So it says, now Saul was consenting to his death at that. I'm going to read through this, then we'll go back and pick it apart. It said, at that time a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Sorry. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Then Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ to them. And the multitudes with one accord heeded the things spoken by Philip, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. For unclean spirits, crying with a loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. And there was great joy in that city. I'm not sure we'll get all the way through all that, but we're going to try. All right. So we've got here Saul, the Benjaminite, all right, top-notch Pharisee guy. It says at that time is important, all right? It lets us know that the rise in persecution from the Jews has escalated because of Stephen's death, all right? We've already seen persecution. We've seen Peter and John, they keep getting in and out of prison. They keep getting drugged before the Sanhedrin over and over because they're preaching Christ. So when they've already been persecuted by the Sanhedrin, they've been beaten, they've been threatened with their lives, they've been told not to preach Christ. But Stephen is the first time that someone has been martyred for that. Someone's actually been executed. And it's kind of like mob violence. It's kind of like a pack of dogs, if you think about it. Once they draw blood, what happens? Everybody goes crazy. It's a feeding frenzy. It's a shark-like, piranha-like feeding frenzy once blood is drawn. And that's what happens. At that time, when Stephen was martyred, all of a sudden, everybody's feeling pretty brave. All of these Jews who are opposed to the Christianity movement, they're feeling pretty brave. And it says, a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, right? So we're only talking about the Jewish people who are Christians in the city of Jerusalem. This is where it begins. But if you remember, Jesus told them, he said, you're going to go and preach and teach and make disciples, first in Jerusalem, then in Judea, and then Samaria, and then to the ends of the world, all right? And this is exactly what's going to happen because of Stephen's martyrdom. It is the Jews that are persecuting the Christians, not the Romans. That doesn't happen for quite a while yet. This is the Jewish people. If you go to chapter 11 of Acts, you see where it talks about some of the Jews who have scattered are up in Antioch and Cilicia and other places and everything, and says some of the men were from Cyprus and all of this. And you notice that everybody they're talking about is a Hellenistic Jew. And remember, we talked about before how the Palestinian Jews who dress like Jews and the Hellenistic Jews, they're called Hellenistic because they have taken on the culture of Rome and Greece, Helen of Troy, Hellenistic. So they dress like Romans. They talk like Romans. They have different dialects, okay? But they come to Jerusalem 3 times a year because they are devout Jews, even though their secular world does not look like the world of the Palestinian Jews. They're more involved in business, less farming, highly educated, some of them well-to-do, but they come back for the festivals 3 times a year like they're required to do, and they have their own synagogues, partly because they speak a different dialect or a totally different language than the Palestinian Jews, so it kind of makes it necessary to have separate synagogues to go to on the Sabbath and worship. But then you get the idea that there's probably a lot of friction between these two groups. The Palestinian Jews consider themselves to be purer Jews than the Hellenistic Jews. So you put that together with what we see in chapter 11, the ones who have been scattered, the majority of them are Hellenistic Jews because the Palestinian Jews don't like them anyway. Do you remember what the first dissension in the New Testament church was over? What was the first disunity thing over? We talked about it around Thanksgiving time or so. Distribution of food to the widows. And the Hellenistic Jews were saying, hey, our widows aren't getting any of the food that's supposed to be distributed. It's only going to the Palestinian widows. So they came together and they chose 7 men. The church decided, yeah, this could be bad. So they chose 7 men, all 7 of them with Greek names. all 7 of them Hellenistic Jews. The first one's name was Stephen. The second one's name was Philip. They're not Palestinian Jews. It was an act of love by the Palestinian church to the Hellenistic Jews that, yeah, we want to stay one. You guys take care of the distribution of the food. We trust you. And that was huge. Satan tried to divide the church, and the church didn't allow it to happen, which was really big. All right? So it makes sense that most of the scattered ones at the very beginning were the Hellenistic Jews that the Palestinians really didn't want in their territory anyway. Okay? Which that kind of follows right along with human nature, doesn't it? So it says this great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem. It says they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. What did Jesus say? Jerusalem, Judea, then Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And so this is fulfillment of what Jesus told them was going to happen. And so they get scattered throughout these regions, except for the apostles. Okay? And there's good reasons for that. Not everybody who was supposed to be saved in the Jerusalem area, in the Palestine area, has been saved yet. There's still people there that need to come to Christ, and that's going to be the apostles' job. Later on, some of them go out further, but for the first several years, the apostles stay in Jerusalem and run things from there. And we know that there's still more fruit to be gathered from what it says right at the very next thing. It says, devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. Now, devout men does not mean Christian. If Luke wanted to tell us that these were believers, he would have used the term believers, okay? But a devout man of God is not a believer. In all of the New Testament, and even in the Old, a devout man was considered someone who took his relationship with God seriously, okay? They weren't yet Christians, but some of them would probably become that. But they were devout men. Not everybody in this mock trial thought that it was right to stone Stephen. And that makes sense too. We never agree on anything, right? So there were people who thought that this was wrong and that it shouldn't have been done. And so these devout men carry him to his burial. Now, also in Deuteronomy, when it talks about stoning someone, an executed person, the law is you must give them a burial. You're not to leave their body lying out for the animals to get. Now, I know that a lot of people say, well, yeah, but Jesus would have been thrown into the trash heap for the animals to get if they hadn't come and asked for his body. That's correct. But who was executing him? Romans. They don't have that. They don't have that rule. The Jews do. All right? So anybody that they stone to death has to have a burial because you're made in the image of God. You're not supposed to disrespect that image. You have to have a burial, but the law goes on and says, and this part is only in the Mishnah, no lamentation or weeping may be made for them. Okay, you can bury them, but nobody better be sorry about it. Okay, we executed them because they deserved it. No weeping, no crying, no mourning over them. Okay, so look what these guys do. These devout men carry Stephen to his burial and make a great lamentation over him. What are they doing? What? Yeah, they're sobbing and they're crying and they're making a lamentation, and it says great, so it's loud. Why are they doing that? What do you think? This is their way to protest that they don't think this was right. They more than likely know Stephen, okay? And even though Stephen has become a believer and these are devout men and they've not, they don't think he deserves death at all. And it's probably not that big a secret that the witnesses were hired, okay? It wasn't a secret at Jesus' trial, probably not a secret at this trial either. But these devout men protest the fact that Stephen was stoned. So the apostles do still have a large number of people there that are going to come to Christ. I don't know that all of these, we don't know anything about that or whatever, but it sounds like there's still a harvest to be harvested there, all right? It says, and in contrast, This is what this means. And devout men made a great lamentation over him. As for Paul, so you see the sharp contrast? It's like these devout guys who took the relationship with God seriously are making a lamentation over Stephen, but Saul, he's making havoc of the church. And that's purposeful to show the stark contrast between devout men of God and a man like Saul who's eaten up with this anger, okay? He's just consumed with this anger. It says he made havoc. The word havoc is a Greek word here that's nowhere else in the New Testament. So we have to look outside the New Testament to see exactly what it means to make havoc. Everywhere else outside the New Testament, it's used of a wild animal who's mangling a human being or tearing apart an animal and shredding it to bloody ribbons, okay? It's also used if you're talking about trying to rip or shred something very finely. So this is what Paul is doing. It describes exactly what he's doing. He's shredding and ripping apart the church, and that's his goal. He's ravaging the church, making havoc of the church. Goes on, he says, entering every house and dragging off men and women. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I have to put up with this World War II buff in my house. And he watches all of these gruesome World War II movies. And what do you always see the Gestapo doing? Coming to people's homes and dragging them out. These people are the Anne Franks of their day, okay? Paul isn't doing this by himself. He's gotten an army of guys from the Sanhedrin. He's just leading it and going from house to house to house to house. And if anyone there says they're a Christian, he's dragging them out, just like the Gestapo did the Jews in World War II. He's dragging them off and committing them to prison, okay? I don't see anything there about a trial. Doesn't look like there is. It says that if they're saying they're a Christian, that's enough to put him in prison, to get him out of here. What's his goal? To eventually kill them, right? That's his goal, yeah. Notice that it says men and women. Even the pagan Romans rarely arrested women, and the Jews almost never did. But Paul, he's making no distinction here. You say you're a Christian, man or woman, it doesn't matter. We're dragging you out of the house, dragging you off. The word dragging off there is the same word that's used when the disciples were dragging their nets to the shore when it was overfilled with fish. Same word. So you can imagine that it's forceful, right? It's very forceful. Yes?
I can see where they drag the men and women out. How about the children? If they have children, do they drag them?
Yeah, probably, because that was one of the reasons that the Romans didn't. The Greeks and the Romans considered it a mark of a civilized society to arrest the men and leave the women at home to take care of the children. So if they're taking the parents, I don't know. I imagine they're taking the children too, or leaving them orphans. I don't know. Good question. Good question. If you go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, talks about the fact that these people suffered imprisonment and the seizure of their property and possessions. That sounds handy, doesn't it? Yeah. So not only are they being thrown in prison, now the Sanhedrin owns their property and all of their possessions. And so even if they get out of prison for some reason, they've got nothing to go back to. Nothing to go back to. Not only that, these people who are being scattered, part of the reason they have to scatter is because their family members who have not converted to Christianity would have nothing to do with them. They've been excommunicated from the family. They're considered that they're dead. They're excommunicated from their synagogue, so there's no support system, and there's no such thing as food stamps, welfare, or any kind of charity organizations. So the people have to move. They have to go. This sounds like it's a really bad thing, but persecution, you often hear it said that persecution purifies the church. Those who aren't really true Christians will say they're not, okay? If it comes to being put in prison, and I'm not really all that devoted to this Christian thing, well, I'll say I'm not. So it gets rid of the hangers-on, the people who are not really true Christians. The ones who are true Christians, it's going to separate them from their comfort, and it's going to put them in a place of dependency on God. And that's persecution. It makes every time that there's been a period of persecution in the Christian church, the church has grown. Because it purifies the church, and the people are then dependent on God. They've been separated from their comfort, and they've been sent out being dependent on God for everything. So it's not a bad thing in God's plan. If you're one of those being persecuted, I'm not sure it's a really nice thing, right? It sounds horrible. It sounds awful. Do we have that going on today? Yes. Lots of places in the world that goes on today. Persecution in the United States takes a different form. The Church of the United States is persecuted by liberal people who say that Christ was not God, that Mary wasn't a virgin, that there's nothing that any God will do, that you don't have to have Jesus in order to get to heaven, that any of the moral laws of the Bible are old-fashioned and taboo. That is a different way of persecuting the church, but the whole goal of persecution is to what? Destroy people? Mm-mm. What's the goal? What's the goal of persecuting the church? Destroy the church. Stop the church. So do you have to drag people out of their homes in order for that to happen? No. You can just weaken the doctrine. You can stop teaching it. You can stop prayer in your schools. You can stop Bible studies. You can stop the Ten Commandments being displayed anywhere. You can teach kids in your schools that this, and this is okay. And you can teach them there's no such thing as truth and there's no such thing as morality. And does that persecute the church? Of course it does. So you have to look at the kind of persecution we're under and realize that Satan has a plan to destroy the church. That's the whole idea, to destroy. To destroy people, to destroy the church. I don't imagine Paul has anything personally against any of these individuals. But if killing them or getting rid of them destroys the church in Jerusalem, he's all about it. And it's interesting because Jesus predicted this. In John 16:2, he was telling the disciples, this is in the upper room when he's talking to them before he goes to the cross. And he says, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. And you notice the picture here is from the execution of Christians in the Middle East. This still happens, right? All over the world. Somalia right now. Yeah. I mean, not Somalia. Sudan right now. Christians are being executed. So Jesus had told them, they're going to put you out of the synagogue. They'll think they're offering a service to God. And that's what Paul thinks. Paul thinks he's doing a good thing. He thinks that this is okay. Later on in Acts, Paul is going to admit, as part of his testimony, 3 different times in Acts. He admits to this in his testimony when he's telling the people how he became to be a Christian and no longer the Pharisee of Pharisees. In Acts 22:4, he says, and I persecuted this way unto the death. So this is not about just putting people in prison. He's trying to kill them. And I'm sure he had several people executed. Unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. He admits to that. In Acts 22:19 and 20, he says, when God is telling him it's time for him to leave and go back to Jerusalem, he says, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. So not only was he going house to house, he's going from synagogue to synagogue. And he's dragging people out and beating them and imprisoning them. And he says, and when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Paul admits to all of that. It's kind of like it's one of the things that Paul wishes he could go back and change. You know, it haunts him probably the rest of his life. But it's important that that's in there because it tells all of us that no matter what you've done, you've not done that. And Paul is still usable by God and still is an instrument of God's work and is still saved. And so we don't have any excuse, right? The next line is really kind of cool when we look in Acts 8. It says, therefore. Therefore always means go back and look what just happened before because this is the cause of what's coming next. It says, therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. I don't know about you, but if we had a persecution going on here, what would you guys do? Where would you go? What? Into a bunker? Yeah. Yeah. They're surrounded, literally surrounded by these caves. Literally surrounded by them. Yeah. But they don't do that. And notice what it says. It says, they went everywhere. That term everywhere is used 11 more times in the book of Acts, and every single time it's used, it means a missionary effort. Isn't that interesting? Every time that word's used in Acts, it means somebody has gone someplace else to preach Christ. Now, it says that's what they're doing. Those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. What were they in trouble for? Preaching the word. These people have already been preaching Christ, and as they scatter and leave, they continue preaching Christ. The very thing that got some of them in prison, got some of them killed, got them beaten, and they're just moving on and continuing to do it. They're not hiding. They're not trying to move to a place where they don't know about Christians and being quiet about it. Instead, the word preaching there means proclaiming. So they just spread out and go proclaiming Christ and just continue doing it. Is that a logical action? Do you think Stephen knew he was going to die that day? Yes, he did. I think Peter and John thought they were going to die multiple times. Because everything that happened to Jesus right down the line happened to Peter and John, happened to Stephen. We're accusing you of blasphemy. We're hiring false witnesses against you. We're bringing you from the Sanhedrin. We're going to do a mock trial. We're going to beat you. And what happened to Jesus after that? He was executed. So they went knowing, preaching, proclaiming Christ in Jerusalem, knowing what the cost was, knowing what could happen to them. All right, so I had this chart here about Stephen and Paul. Both Hellenistic Jews. Should have had a lot in common, okay? Neither one of them are Palestinian Jews. They were both rejected by the Jews who are the Jewish leadership. Their teachings were rejected. They personally were rejected, okay? They did it to Stephen. They did it to Saul. They were argued against in the synagogues. Stephen got argued against in the synagogues probably by Paul as one of them at the beginning. Later on, Paul's going to be argued against and thrown out of multiple synagogues because he goes there first in every city. These are Hellenistic synagogues, by the way, because they're not in Palestine. And he goes to them and he preaches Christ to them first, and he gets kicked out of them. So same thing happens to him. Both of them get accused of blasphemy against the word of God, against Moses, against the law, against everything, the temple, everything. Stephen got accused of that. Paul gets accused of that also. They were both dragged out of cities and stoned. Paul was left for dead. They thought he was dead. They had stoned him and thought the work was finished, and he wasn't. We don't really know if Paul was resurrected or if he was just unconscious. But somebody didn't do a very thorough job of checking the body, and they hadn't bothered to start burying him yet, and he got up and walked away. Interesting. And they were both martyred. Stephen is martyred by Jewish leaders. Paul gets martyred by the Romans. You know, the only real difference between Stephen and Paul is that Stephen got to die quickly. Paul lives a long life and is beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and thrown out of synagogues, imprisoned multiple times. What? And snake bit. That's Rob's worst one, yeah. And he's snake bit. He suffered so many things. But you know, when Jesus was talking to Ananias and told him, go get Paul and bring him to me, I'm sending him to the Gentiles, but first I need to tell him all the ways he's going to suffer for serving me. It was part of the deal from the get-go. What's that? Say that again. Oh, you think that was Paul's punishment? I think Paul was totally forgiven. You know, we're all totally forgiven. I hope we're not all punished the same way we've been stupid.
Well,
Well, yeah, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, people today would say karma. God says my name is not karma. Yeah. Um, but it's interesting. I think it shows that both of them were sold out to what they believed. And that comes with a price. Being totally committed and willing to die for your faith. And I think that's why all of those things happen. And he has a job for Paul to do that he hadn't finished yet. And so we looked a little bit last week about how this martyrdom of Stephen, how did this, we're probably not going to get to Philip, right? How this martyrdom of Stephen, was a good thing. We talked about how it spread the church, how it put people on fire. We talk about people being on fire for the Lord all the time. But, have you ever tried to stomp out a fire? When you stomp it out, you can get part of the fire, but then there's all these embers that scatter. And what do? They continue to burn. And that's kind of like these people who were being persecuted. Satan is trying to stomp out the church, but all he succeeds in doing is sending the fire out to start, one little spark, one little flame starts a big fire. And we wind up with big churches in Philippi and Antioch and all these different places, which would not have happened if they hadn't been scattered. Now, I know in our Hallmark world, we would like to have seen God use a different method to grow the church than this, wouldn't we? But again, it shows how God can use any horrible thing that Satan comes up with and turn it into something good. Because remember that Satan is truly in charge of this world, but God is sovereign over everything, including Satan. So Satan can do his worst, and God can intervene and make all things work to the good to those who are called according to his purpose. And that's what this martyrdom is like. And I think it's interesting that we're having this lesson this week, because today is what, the 6th? 5th? Today's the 5th. Okay, in 3 more days, January 8th, it'll be the 70th anniversary of the slaughter of 5 young missionaries who went to Ecuador. The oldest one was early 30s. They were in their 20s and 30s, these 5 guys. You probably have heard Jim Elliot's name and Nate Saint's name, 2 of the missionaries that went. The reason you hear their name is because Jim Elliot's wife and Nate Saint's sister actually went back to Ecuador after these guys were slaughtered to carry on the ministry. On January 8, 1956, they landed their plane on the beach in Ecuador, planning to minister to the Auca people, A-U-C-A, this Auca tribe of people who were pagan. They were all 5 speared to death immediately. Jim Elliot, we have a journal that Jim Elliot had written for several years. He had begged God to send him to the Auca people and send him soon. Some of the other things he said in his journal were things like, God, I don't care if I don't have a long life. I want to have a meaningful life like yours. Make me mean something. Make me valuable to your kingdom. You probably know one of his statements, one of his famous quotes. It actually didn't originate with him. It's actually from the 1500s, but he used it a lot. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Think about that. You can apply that to your finances. You can apply that to your children. You can apply that to your job. You can apply that to your life. And he did. He planned it. I mean, he believed it. At the time, this appeared to be one of the greatest tragedies in the Christian church today. But in the modern era, it's been talked about as it was akin to Stephen. If you think about Stephen, he's young. We heard his sermon. How powerful was that? Well-spoken, highly educated. He's a very new believer, and he's on fire for the Lord and very evangelistic. By the way, evangelism is not a gift. It's a command in Scripture. We all are commanded to go, not just certain people. So this has been compared to that. These guys had so much talent, so much ability. They were educated to be missionaries. They knew their Bible. They were on fire. They had families. They had a lot of potential, and all 5 of them are wiped out. So it didn't seem like there was any way that anything good could come out of this, because these highly trained, highly skilled missionaries dedicated to the Lord were just sacrificed to a people who didn't even want to listen to what they had to say. I'm looking for my rest of my notes. Yeah. Really? The Aka Indians? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. His son, Jim Elliot, has gone down there as a missionary since then. Yeah. Yes. Sure. Sure. Interestingly, a missionary movement started in Ecuador because of this. Eventually, the whole tribe of the Aka Indians was evangelized, and there was a church planted there, but it didn't stop there. They evangelized other tribes in Ecuador and the surrounding countries in that area, and it spread. It was a very powerful movement, which probably wouldn't have happened otherwise, this persecution. Elizabeth Elliot, his wife, yes, she wrote a book called Beyond the Gates of Splendor. And you can buy that, and there's also a movie about that on YouTube, I believe. One of the quotes she had in here was, "God will not protect you from anything that will make you more like Jesus." I think the American church really needs to hear that today. You know, we have this whole big movement going that God wants you happy, and He wants you rich, and He wants you wealthy, and just ask, and you'll get it. If you have enough faith, just ask, and you'll get everything. And we oftentimes feel like, well, I'm a believer, and I do what I'm supposed to do, but yet this bad, horrible thing happened. God, where were you? And I like this. God will not protect you from anything that will make you more like Jesus. So all of those things that you've had to go through that you didn't want to go through, hopefully they've helped to make you more like Jesus, because that's the point. That's the point. Nobody ever wants to go through them again either, right? We don't want to go through it again. But we do know that we grow through those things. All right, let me go back here. If it didn't lose it. Did that come up? Yeah. This is just a really short video. There's a book called, where do I have this? This one, Beyond the Gates of Splendor. There's a book and a movie. She wrote that in 1957, okay? And then there's also another movie called End of the Spear. And actually, there is one of them, I can't remember what it's called now, and it's been made into a musical. I'm not really sure about that yet. I have not looked at that, but I'm not sure how you can make that into a musical, but evidently somebody did. But I wanted to show you this short little video. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. Hang on here.
Jim Elliot said the famous words years before his martyrdom: "That man is no fool. Give what he cannot keep, to gain what he cannot." And he prayed as a young man, "God, I pray, light these idle sticks of my life, and may I burn up for thee. Consume my life, my God, fruit is thine. I seek not a long life, but a full one, like yours, Lord Jesus." Nate Saint, along with Jim Elliot and 3 others, American missionaries, were all martyred by the Auca Indians, 1956 in Ecuador. It was only after many years that Steve Saint, Nate's son, Nate was the pilot, the account a few weeks back of the details of the martyrdom. It was an overwhelming thing to read. It was painful. It was tragic. It was tremendously moving. One of the men, the last one, instead of running into the jungle where he could have easily gotten away, he just waded out to the water and in his broken dialect said, "Why are you killing us? We're not hurting you," and waited there until they came and speared him. And no sooner had they killed the last one, each one of the different ones began to hear singing, and they looked up and there were these glowing beings in the trees, singing and praising God. Then when they were waiting and hiding, waiting for the retaliation, nobody came to kill them. They began to realize something's different about these people. That's why they were so open to the gospel and came back. It's an extraordinary story. Listen to what Nate Saint wrote years earlier. People who do not know the Lord ask, why in the world we waste our lives as missionaries? They forget they too are expending their lives, and when the bubble has burst, they will have nothing of eternal significance to show for the years they have wasted. Everybody's bubble is going to burst. Every one of us at the end of our lives, it's all gone. Then what? What do we spend our lives for? What do we pour ourselves out for? Where do we give ourselves to? Having a full life is not necessarily a long life. I want at the end of my life to say I fulfilled the purposes of God.
There we go. That's the end of it. Okay. So what do you think about that? Well, you know, and that's the interesting part of that, is because when we get to Philip, which we won't get to tonight, we'll have to do that next week. You know, Philip wasn't anything special either. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples. He didn't have any extra training than any of the other Christians at that time were getting, but he turns out to just be an amazing messenger for God, and that's who we're going to talk about next week in chapter 8, I think starting around verse 9 or so. No, verse 4 and 5 is where we're going to start next week. But when I was reading through this stuff, one of the comments about this was that, no, I don't. Can you not hear me? My voice is so soft, Rob. It's done. Oh, no, it's not. It's dying. Anyways, okay, so I'll talk fast. So one of the things... Maybe not. Anyway, one of the paragraphs that I read in this when talking about this was that one young man who was a missionary was telling another